Welcome to this introduction, pre-performance talk. In 1 hour, the second part of the Ring, the Nibelungen will begin. Die Walküre by Richard Wagner. My name is Katarina Aronsson. I am dramaturg and head of programming here at the Royal Swedish Opera. And last autumn, I went to an opera conference in Oxford, and I met my guest here today, Barry Millington, and I asked him if he would like to come here and see the Ring, and he said yes. And he also said yes to doing 2 introductions today and on Saturday before Siegfried. So I think I'm so happy to have you here, Barry Millington.
Thank you.
Yes. I just want to say a couple of things about you. You have written 8 books about Richard Wagner. The latest being The Sorcerer of Bayreuth, 2012, that was published. And you have also written the articles about Richard Wagner in the new dictionary of the Grove's New Dictionary of Music and Musicians. And also you are the founder and editor of the Wagner Journal. So, who could better be introducing this to us? So, I leave the word to you. Very welcome. Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Katarina. It's a very great pleasure to be back here in Stockholm. It's such a beautiful city. I haven't been here for 10 years, and it's been far too long. And it's wonderful to come back on the occasion of this very interesting ring cycle, as I can tell from last night already, and to share something of it with you. Now, as promised, I'm going to be talking primarily about Die Walküre today, but I thought it might be appropriate to just say a few words to put it in a context, in the context of the Ring itself, and perhaps to try to give some idea of just how innovatory this incredible ring cycle is, or was, in the 19th century. And one can see this in several ways. The first big innovation in Wagner's Ring is the scale of it. As I'm sure you know, it takes place over some 14 hours, 4 days. No one had ever attempted anything on that scale before. A typical Handel opera would be perhaps 2 to 3 hours. Even Rossini's William Tell would only be 4 hours, and these are all dwarfed by Götterdämmerung alone, let alone the Ring as a whole, of course. Then in terms of subject matter, now, of course, operas had been traditionally written on mythological subjects. If one thinks of Monteverdi, Cavalli, the whole genre of opera seria, they dealt with characters from Greek mythology, Ulysses, Electra, and so forth. But Wagner was the first to plunder the Icelandic myths, and then to present dramas in which mythological characters become psychological archetypes. And they achieve a richness and a depth that comes from their being both akin to human beings of today, like you and me, and politicians and rulers, ordinary human beings, as well as operating simultaneously on a profound psychological level, reflecting aspects of the human condition such as the ego, the shadow, etc. So all this was completely new. Operas before Wagner had a text, of course, written by a librettist, which would then be set by the composer in a more or less generalized way. But Wagner was different. He wanted his text to be unique. Only he could set it down as he conceived it, and it would then call forth the music that he, the creator, originally divined for it. Now, every line of music in this new artwork would be shaped by the nuances of this unique and original text. I'll be saying a little more about this musico-poetic synthesis, as I call it, in a minute. But this concept of music drama, as opposed to conventional opera, was absolutely new too. Now, previous operas essentially involved sequences of recitative, aria, duets, trios, and choruses, but Wagner had no use for these forms. He maintained that the music had to follow the sense of the text, line by line, and so he created these vast periods, which are neither pure recitative nor aria, but a kind of arioso. Duets and choruses were banned altogether, at least in Wagner's theoretical essays. In practice, he relented occasionally later on. Now, in order to sustain these vast structures of several hours, Wagner realized that he had to create a new system of thematic organization. And this involved the famous leitmotifs, which are short motifs representing objects like the sword and the spear, characters or ideas such as renunciation, redemption, which served to bind these huge, through-composed structures together. And finally, Wagner had clear ideas about how his music dramas should be staged, or perhaps we should say that at this stage he had clear ideas about how they should not be staged, i.e. not like conventional operas in the traditional theatre. Wagner effectively staged his music dramas himself, becoming the first director of opera in the modern sense, and leaving the conducting of the music, which, by the way, he regarded as subsidiary, to another. Now, this is Ludwig Feuerbach, the philosopher, and I maintain that it's impossible to understand the Ring properly without some understanding of Ludwig Feuerbach. So just a few words about him. Now, Feuerbach was the leading figure in German philosophy in the 1840s, and he was a mentor for the young radicals like Wagner, who were longing for a revolution to overturn existing society. Feuerbach was a follower of Hegel, previously the godfather, if you like, of German philosophers. After Hegel's death, there was a split, and the young or left Hegelians were led by Feuerbach. Marx and Engels were also prominent, but Feuerbach was hugely influential. Engels in 1888 said, "We all became at once Feuerbachians." Now, in 1841, which is a few years before Wagner began to set the Ring down, Feuerbach published a work called in English, The Essence of Christianity. The English translation, by the way, was done by no less a person than George Eliot, the novelist. Now, The Essence of Christianity was, I think we can say, a bombshell. I'm sorry, can't avoid the cliche. It really was. Because in this book, God was projected as merely, God was represented rather as merely a projection of human fantasies, desires, and needs. The conventional wisdom, of course, was that God had created man, but Feuerbach turns this on its head and says, no, it's mankind that's created God or gods. We long for unconditional love, Feuerbach said, so we create a God who represents endless love. We wish we could control the world around us, so we create a God who's omnipotent. And above all, we fear death, so we create a God who's immortal. And in this book, The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach goes on to say two very important things here. Religion is the dream of the human mind. An echo, if you like, or echoed in Marx's famous maxim that religion is the opium of the people. And the second point he says is the divine being is nothing else than the human being, or rather, the human nature purified, freed from the limits of the individual man, made objective, i.e., contemplated and revered as another, a distinct being. And this is his summary. All the attributes of the divine nature are, therefore, attributes of the human nature. So, in other words, he's saying, we've created God in our own image. We've set up a divine entity that is everything we are not, but which we would like to be, perfect, eternal, and almighty. Now, it's important to emphasize that Feuerbach is not dismissing the concept of God as irrelevant or pointless superstition. On the contrary, he argues that religion fulfills certain basic human needs. It enables us to come to terms with existential problems such as death, and it affords us an element of control over our lives. Now, one of the terms Wagner borrowed from Feuerbach is Not, spelled N-O-T or N-O-T-H in Old German, which means need or necessity. Now, necessity was a concept of the young Hegelians indicating an overwhelming natural force that would arise in the breasts of the populace, driving them to liberation. And we see this often in The Ring. Not or need is frequently mentioned. Siegfried's sword, of course, is called Notung, or needful. And his father Siegmund tells Sieglinde, just before he draws it from the tree and rushes out into the forest with her, that he was promised that sword by his own father Wälser in his hour of need. Now, what Wagner responded to above all in Feuerbach's philosophy was his celebration of love. What Engels, several decades later, was to describe, I think with just a hint of disdain, as Feuerbach's extravagant glorification of love. Engels, of course, like Marx, felt that Feuerbach had given too much attention to the principle of love and not enough to the emancipation of the proletariat. But it was music to Wagner's ears in the late 1840s and 50s. This painting, by the way, is by the artist Mariano Fortuny, a wonderful painting, I think, of 1928, showing, of course, Siegmund and Sieglinde. Now, for Feuerbach, the essence of human nature and the source of its morality is the I-you relationship. Morality, he says, is inconceivable for the solo being, for the solitary being. Only in conjunction with another, by creating a mutual drive to happiness, does an individual develop any consciousness of social responsibility. Well, the love affairs of Siegmund and Sieglinde in Die Walküre and Siegfried and Brünnhilde later in the cycle both embody this kind of life-affirming philosophy. So I think Wagner's enthusiasm for Feuerbach can be explained in something like the following terms. For Feuerbach, there was an underlying harmony between the laws of nature and human conduct. That harmony was disrupted by what Wagner, following Feuerbach, calls Willkür, which means the arbitrary as opposed to the necessary. The dictates of religion, for example, are arbitrary in this view, as are those of nationality or state. Now, in The Ring, Wagner repeatedly celebrates the necessary over the arbitrary. The sword Notung is a constant symbolic reminder of the power of necessity. And Siegmund accepts his destiny in these terms, you remember: highest need of holiest love, consuming need of yearning desire. Well, Wotan disrupted that harmony by his crimes against nature. Remember, before the action of Rheingold starts, he tore off the branch of the world ash tree in the pursuit of wisdom. Well, in Feuerbach's terms, he represents the conflict between the arbitrary and the natural. But Wotan's grandson Siegfried will make all well again. At least that was the plan, but as we know, he too fell prey to forces beyond his control. Now, in The Ring at Covent Garden a few years ago, which is coming back next year by Keith Warner, some of you may have seen it, in this production, central to Keith Warner's idea is Wagner's understanding of the world as mediated by Feuerbach. Wotan may have the trappings of a god, but he's actually a representative of the human race. In Das Rheingold, Wotan endeavors to shore up his power by resorting to devious tactics. In order to pay the bill for his grand new fortress Valhalla, he decides to steal the ring from Alberich. He sinks deeper and deeper into the mire of compromises and deception, and his wife Fricka exposes his self-deception, and he caves in, as he has to her demand that Siegmund, Wotan's son, be punished for his illicit, incestuous love. Now, the really extraordinary thing is that Wotan's abdication of power is voluntary. It's under pressure, he's under pressure, it's true, from Fricka, but Wotan comes to realize the error of his ways and indeed of human existence, and he actually wills his own downfall. Political leaders and gods don't normally, of course, give up power without a struggle, but Wagner is saying here that the God-centered universe has had its day. It's time for a new era in which human beings decide things for themselves. Feuerbach was, as I've said, a leading force in undermining the hegemony of Christianity, though there were many other figures too, including David Friedrich Strauss, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, and others. Now, Wotan's spear, you remember on the shaft of the spear are engraved the laws and contracts that bind him and social beings generally. And the spear motif is ubiquitous. We hear it throughout the cycle. So why is the truly free hero needed? Well, as Fricka points out, the gods themselves are unable to retrieve the ring precisely because they are the guardians of the law. We're looking here at a world governed by religious authority, by the Church, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and so forth. But there's a legal framework, a system of values, all based on the idea of a god. And stable society rests on this idea. But with Feuerbach, we're presented with a new world order. And you could say that this whole thing is summed up by two motifs in the ring cycle. The first is the motif of the spear, which I've mentioned, which sounds as it looks. It sounds like a spear being held out. Bum, ba bum, ba bum, 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 bum. It's a very graphic, representational motif. And what Wagner does with this motif is very interesting. He cuts it in half, as it were, and you hear the first four notes of it. Bum, or start lower down, dum, da, 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 and then he goes up a seventh instead of continuing that downward motion. So you have dum, da, 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 dum, bum, bum, and you can hear the difference. From Wotan's spear, which represents power and authority, at a stroke we have the converse of that, which is the motif representing Brunhilde's love and compassion. So compassion and love are counterposed, if you like, to power and authority. And Wagner does this very cleverly and succinctly in two simple leitmotifs, which you'll hear again and again, not least tonight. So, to summarize this part of it, this is, I would argue, the philosophical core of the ring. It's about the end of a world order governed by God or gods, and the transformation into a new humanistic world order, one in which individual men and women take responsibility for their own actions. And of course, in which love and compassion are prized more than power and material possessions. Wagner himself once said, "Take a good look at Wotan. He resembles us to a T." And Wagner is telling us clearly here that Wotan is in fact a human being, just like us, with all our noble aspirations and deceitful manipulation, our innocence and our guilt, our loving compassion and our burning hatred. Wotan's original project was for this world ruled by laws and contracts, but it becomes one governed by free and noble beings, brought about by an autonomous hero who's no longer shackled by legal or religious obligations. And this necessarily means the end of Wotan's order, the divinely ordained world to the human. And we might perhaps see this tension between the desire to make the world a better place and Wotan's ambition. One could say that this is the crux of politics, which I think makes it such a timely piece, a piece that remains relevant today. This tension between a character, a god's desire to improve the world, to better the world, but at the same time he's a man of ambition, and I think that makes him a very contemporary figure. So much for the ideas behind the work. Now let me say something more about the music, because I mentioned earlier how Wagner detested conventional opera and how he was determined to create a new kind of work which he called music drama. And it's in this work, in Die Walküre, that Wagner was at the height of his powers as a music dramatist as opposed to a conventional opera composer. And in one of his long essays called Opera and Drama, he writes in 1851, he sets out effectively a blueprint for this artwork of the future. And it's here that he describes this musico-poetic synthesis that I've already mentioned, this fusion of text and music. And he puts that into practice in Das Rheingold, which we heard last night, in a very methodical way. Maybe too methodical, in the sense that the musical content has to give way to verbal criteria. But in the Walküre, which we hear tonight, and particularly in Act 1, which I think is the pinnacle of Wagner's word setting, we hear a really masterly fusion of the text and the music. Which I think he never achieved again, because in Siegfried and Götterdämmerung he moved on to do something a little different. Musical criteria become more prevalent, more important there. But in Act 1 of Die Walküre, we see him absolutely at the apex of his abilities as a music dramatist, combining these two elements of music and text. And central to this was Wagner's understanding and appreciation of another philosopher called Arthur Schopenhauer, a name much more commonly linked with Wagner, of course, although I do believe that Schopenhauer's influence on Wagner was of a more limited nature than was that of Feuerbach. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer was the philosopher that Wagner encountered at precisely this time. Now, the important thing about Schopenhauer was that for him, music was chief among the arts. And I think that Wagner wanted to believe this, and for a time he was wrong-footed. Was music to be primary, or was it to be equal to the text in this synthesis? Well, I think perhaps the best way that I can show you how this synthesis works is by looking at a short section of the Act 1 of Die Walküre, a particularly wonderful piece of writing by Wagner. And it comes from Sieglinde's narration. This is the narration in which she tells Siegmund, but tells us as well, of course, about her wedding, this forced wedding to Hunding, and how the guests come and go at the wedding feast, and one particular stranger arrives. And this is the text you can see there. I hope you can read it. It's in English, and the music example I'm going to play to you is also in English. It's taken from the ENO recording conducted by Reginald Goodall. And the reason I'm doing that is that when I give this example to English-speaking audiences, and you're very kind to be listening to me in English, it's easier to make the point than it is in German. And with Andrew Porter's masterly translation, one loses absolutely nothing, frankly, because he's so careful to represent each word of the German with a good English equivalent. And so we can see how this works in this in this extract. I'll just go through it briefly, line by line. Sadly I sat, And when she sings this, you'll hear a semitonal fall. It's what musicians call an appoggiatura, da-dum, which is the traditional trope for sadness, a falling semitone or tone. While they were drinking, a stranger entered the house, and here we hear a motif which is the Valhalla motif, much heard last night. Bom, bom, tom, 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 tom. So that's telling us who this stranger is. It's the man who had Valhalla built for him, the wanderer, Wotan. An old man dressed all in grey, his hat hung so low. Well, how would you represent a hat in music, you might ask? Well, Wagner manages to do it, and he does it by having this low-lying line suggesting the brim of the hat, a straight vocal line. One of his eyes was hidden, but the others flash, and you'll hear this flash marvelously projected in the vocal line, filled them with terror. You'll hear threatening brass here. None could counter that threatening gaze. Well, again, how on earth would you represent a gaze in music? And he does this by, as it were, showing the rise and fall of the eyebrows. It goes up and down. I alone, you'll hear the scoring thinned out here to just violas and cellos, felt in those glances sweet yearning regret. You'll hear this wonderful, slow descending chromatic line expressing yearning and regret, but at the same time sorrow and solace in one. And this is what Wagner is so good at, combining two completely opposite emotions in one: the sorrow with the falling appoggiatura and the solace with a wonderful warm major chord. On me smiling, he glared at the others. In his hand he carried a sword. We'll hear the sword motif, strong and masculine and phallic, swung in his hands, drove it deep into the ash tree's trunk to the hilt, buried it there, and you'll hear the sword firmly buried in the tree. So let's hear this example, example of musico-poetic synthesis from Act 1 of Die Walküre. Isn't that amazing? I mean, and the extraordinary thing is that it's chosen not quite at random, because I think that is one of the finest passages, but I could have chosen a dozen similar passages, all from Act 1 of Die Walküre, to make those points. Now, strings are often divided in this work and in the Ring generally to give them a richer texture. They're very prominent in the first scene. The cellos play a big role, but also the violas often dominate rather than the violins. Worth listening out for the violas always. By contrast, in scene 2 of Act 1, with the arrival of Hunding, is heralded by the portentous tones of a chorus of Wagner tubas, underpinned by a contrabass tuba. Now, the sense of menace and foreboding here is palpable. Just a word about the Wagner tuba. It's a kind of tuba that's played by an extra section of horn players, and Wagner himself conceived the idea of these instruments and had them made specially. The design was based on some instruments he had observed in the workshop of Adolf Sax, the inventor of the saxophone. And the purpose of these Wagner tubas was to bridge the gap between the horns and the tubas. And he wanted a variety of brass tone right through a rich variety right through the compass. And these Wagner tubas have a wonderfully rich and noble velvety sound. This is what a section of Wagner tubas looks like. 2 tenors and 2 basses. And this shows how popular they are. But more seriously, the orchestration often presents solo instruments, and we tend to think of Wagner's orchestration as being big and loud, but it isn't always by any means. It's often of a very chamber-like nature, and you hear a lot of solo instruments and instruments in combinations. You might hear, for example, a bass clarinet combined with a viola, or a trumpet with a cor anglais. It's very precisely heard and realized by Wagner. Well, there's no shortage of purple passages in Die Walküre, of course. In Act 1, we have the famous Winterstürmer, sung by Siegmund, and that gorgeous long duet for the lovers that occupies the latter stages of the act. In Act 3, we have the infamous Ride of the Valkyries and that wonderful music for Wotan and Brunhilde towards the end. But I just want to, in the time left to me, to say something about Act 2, because it's the second act that contains 2 of the most stupendous scenes in all opera. And they can seem long and difficult, but here Wagner is at his most original and imaginative, so some understanding of how these scenes work can enhance our appreciation of the cycle as a whole. And the first of those big scenes is the scene for Wotan's monologue, in which Wotan bears his soul to his favorite daughter Brunhilde. Now, when the scene starts, Wotan's been subjected to a tongue lashing by Fricka, and Fricka tells him in no uncertain terms that she can't tolerate the behavior of Siegmund and Sieglinde. When did it ever happen, she says, that brother and sister fell in love? Well, of course, she's got a point. And Wotan tries to tell her that it may not be a regular occurrence, but it's happened now. And it's happened because they were in love, which makes everything all right for him. Well, of course, it doesn't wash with Fricka, but she finally defeats Wotan, I think interestingly, not on the high ground of moral propriety, but by reminding him that Siegmund is not the free hero that Wotan is making him out to be. He's the tool of the gods, carrying out Wotan's own will. So Wotan gives in and promises to withdraw his support for Siegmund in the coming fight with Hunding. And this is where Brunhilde comes in the second scene for this narration. In the marvellous production of this work by Patrice Chéreau at Bayreuth, which you may have seen in the theatre or on television, there's a huge full-length mirror right in front of Wotan, so that the character appears to be looking right into his own soul. And much of this monologue for Wotan is, in fact, little more than recitative. That is to say, the actual musical content is less important than the words and the music. And as Wotan unfolds his narrative, more and more motifs appear, revealing new aspects of his state of mind. His ambitions that we heard about in Rheingold have come to nothing, and he's now on the point of relinquishing all his claims to power and political control. The emptiness of things is revealed to him, and he wants to withdraw from the world. But why are you so anxious? Brunhilde asks him. Have we ever failed in our task? But it gets worse, Wotan replies, and to the accompaniment of this stately motif of Erda and a nervous, jabbing motif of Alberich and his ill will, Wotan goes on to tell Brunhilde that Erda warned him that a son born to Alberich would spell the end of the gods. And gradually, as the narrative unfolds, an extraordinary thing becomes evident. Wotan is moving towards a fateful decision. He will no longer strive to be master, he says. He'll no longer seek to defeat Alberich or help his son Siegmund in the coming struggle. Instead, he will voluntarily give up all claims to power. And he now seeks only one thing: the end, das Ende. He's reached the point where he's prepared to renounce everything, even life itself. Well, as I said before, political leaders don't normally give up their power without a struggle, but what Wagner is saying here, inspired by Feuerbach, is that the gods have had their day. It's time for a new era in which human beings decide things for themselves. I think that's as good a place as any to end. I could go on to talk about the other scene, which is the Annunciation of Death, which is a wonderful scene, but we can hear that tonight, the scene for Brunhilde appearing to Siegmund, and then the wonderful music in Act 3. It's all too much for one evening, perhaps, but I hope that I've been able to give you some idea of how Wagner's principles work in that first act, where we have this very clever, masterly synthesis of the words and the music, and in the second act, particularly with these philosophical Feuerbachian ideas underpinning the whole drama. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the opera this evening. Thank you. Thank you very much.